The sun had begun its slow descent behind the desert hills, spilling golden fire across the horizon. The air shimmered with heat and dust, and every gust of wind carried the scent of dry sage and distance. A single rider moved along the winding road, his horse's hooves kicking up clouds that glowed in the dying light. He was lean, weathered, and silent, a man whose life had been carved by years of wandering. His name was Eli Cartwright, once a ranch hand, then a drifter, and later a name whispered around saloons and border towns. There was a time when his reputation rode ahead of him. A quick hand with a colt, a man who never stayed long enough to plant roots. But now the dust on his boots told another story, one of exhaustion, of miles and regrets that no trail could leave behind. 7 years. That was how long it had been since he last saw his ranch, or the woman who once stood at its gate waving goodbye, the evening sun behind her like a halo. 7 years since he'd promised to return before the first snow. He had meant it then, but life in the frontier had a way of swallowing promises whole. He had worked cattle drives from Texas to Montana, ridden guard on wagon trains, even fought off outlaws for men richer than he'd ever be. He'd slept under stars so cold they burned, woken to gunfire, and learned to trust no one but his horse and the wind. But now, as the sky turned from gold to deep violet, something in him ached stronger than the call of the open road, a pull toward home. Reaching into his saddlebag, Eli drew out a worn letter. The paper yellowed, edges softened by time. The ink had faded, but the handwriting was still unmistakable. Mary's, his wife's. He'd read it so many times he could trace the words in the dark. Eli, the girls ask about you every evening. Clara says she remembers your voice, though she was so small when you left. June points at every rider in the distance and asks, "Is that Pa?" I tell them you're out there somewhere under the same stars, finding your way back. The letter had been written 3 winters ago. It was the last one that ever reached him. After that, silence, the kind that hollows a man out from the inside. He folded the paper carefully and tucked it back into his coat. His horse snorted softly, feeling his unease. "Almost there, Daisy," he murmured, patting her neck. "Just a little farther, girl." The land began to change, dry scrub giving way to familiar ridges and twisted mesquite trees. He could almost see the outline of the old windmill that once groaned through every night, turning slow and steady above the Cartwright ranch. The thought brought a sting behind his eyes. When Eli had first left, he told himself he was doing it for them, to earn enough to build a bigger barn, buy better horses, maybe even a new wagon for Mary. But as the years passed, that dream stretched thin. Work led to travel, travel led to trouble, and before long he was chasing shadows just to keep from thinking about what he'd lost. Now, with every step of his tired mare, he felt time pressing down on him like a heavy blanket. What if Mary had moved on? What if someone else tended his land, tucked his daughters into bed, told them stories by the fire? The thought twisted in his gut. The road dipped into a shallow valley, where a dry creek bed cut across the plain. The air cooled, and the first stars blinked awake overhead. Eli paused his horse at the crest of the hill and looked out. In the far distance, nestled against the sunset's last light, he saw it, the ranch. The roof line was crooked, the barn smaller than he remembered, but the old fence still wrapped around it like a protective arm. And there, standing proud against the fading glow, was the wooden gate he'd built with his own hands. The paint was long gone, the wood split by years of wind and sun, yet it still stood. The sign above it read Cartwright Ranch, barely legible, but still hanging on. Eli stopped. For a long while he didn't move. The sight of home, so close after so many years, filled him with both hope and dread. He could almost hear Mary's laughter again, soft, tired, but full of warmth. He could almost feel the weight of his little girl's hand in his, but he knew time changed people. Maybe she'd stopped waiting. Maybe the children would not even know his name. Maybe home wasn't home anymore. He drew a slow breath and looked up at the sky, streaked with crimson clouds. "I don't know what I'll find," he whispered, "but I reckon it's time I found out." The horse stirred and he nudged her forward. The road ahead was short now, just a few hundred yards, yet each step felt heavier than the last. Every sound seemed amplified, the jingle of his spurs, the creak of saddle leather, the lonely cry of a hawk circling above. As he neared the gate, the air filled with the smell of dust and old wood. He stopped just short of it, his hand tightening on the reins. The evening breeze carried faint sounds from the house, the bark of a dog, the clang of a bucket. Someone was there, Eli swallowed hard. His heart, steady through gunfights and storms, now raced like a frightened colt. He dismounted slowly, his boots sinking into the sand. He stood there for a moment, hat in hand, staring at the gate as though it were a doorway to another life. He ran his fingers across the rough timber, tracing the initials he'd carved there years ago, E+M. The carving was faded but still visible, like the echo of a promise. He smiled sadly. "Guess you held on better than I did," he murmured. Behind him, the sky flamed orange one last time before surrendering to twilight. The light bathed the land in soft gold, turning every shadow into a memory. The moment felt almost holy, the end of a journey and the beginning of another. Eli rested his hand on the gate and looked toward the small house at the end of the trail. A figure stood on the porch, distant, unmoving. He couldn't tell if it was her or a trick of the light, but something in his chest stirred, fierce and fragile. He whispered to himself, "We made it, Mary. Took me long enough, but I'm home." The horse gave a low whinny as if to answer. The wind blew gently through the sagebrush, carrying the scent of rain far off to the west. Eli lifted the gate latch, slow, deliberate, and stepped forward. The sound of hinges creaking filled the quiet air, a sound both mournful and full of promise. And as the last rays of sunlight fell across the land, Eli Cartwright, the man who had once ridden through gunfire and loneliness, walked home through the golden dust of his own redemption. The sound of creaking hinges echoed across the quiet valley. Mary Cartwright turned her head slightly, her hands still resting on the wooden gate. The sun was setting fast now. Long ribbons of red and gold streaked across the horizon, bathing the ranch in a warm, aching glow. She squinted toward the trail, one hand shading her eyes, her heart suddenly thudding with an old, forgotten rhythm. For a heartbeat, she thought it was another ranch hand returning from town. But something about the way that rider sat in the saddle, tall, still, as though weighed down by years rather than distance, stirred something deep inside her chest. 7 years. She whispered the number like a prayer and a curse. 7 years since the morning Eli rode away, promising he'd be back before the first snow. There had been many snows since then, each one melting a little more of her hope. She'd kept the ranch running with the help of 2 hired hands and her own stubborn grit. Her hands were calloused now. Her hair, once the color of honey, had silver threads running through it. But her eyes, sharp and amber like a hawk's, still carried that spark of strength that had once drawn Eli to her. Her daughters, Clara and June, played near the corral, their laughter carrying across the yard like wind chimes. Clara, the elder, was 12 now, long-legged, serious, already taking on the shape of the woman she'd one day be. June, only 6, was all wild curls and wonder, chasing the chickens and singing to herself. Mary smiled faintly as she watched them, but the smile faded when the rider grew closer. Dust rose behind him in a golden halo, and for a moment, the light caught his face. She froze. That jawline, the tilt of his hat, the way he dismounted, slow, deliberate, like a man who'd learned to live carefully. She knew them all. Her breath caught in her throat. It can't be. The man removed his hat, revealing hair streaked with gray, his face cut by years of sun and sorrow. But beneath the dust and weariness, she saw the eyes. Those same blue-gray eyes that once looked at her like she was the only thing left worth believing in. Her voice trembled. "Eli?" He stopped a few feet away, hat in hand, and for a moment he didn't speak. The silence stretched between them like the desert itself, wide, empty, heavy with everything unsaid. Finally, he nodded. "It's me, Mary." The years between them seemed to collapse in that single breath. Clara turned at the sound of the name. "Mama, who's that man?" Mary looked at her daughter, the same shade of hair as Eli's, the same stubborn set of jaw, and then back at him. Her throat tightened. "That's your father." June stopped mid-step, eyes wide as sunrise. "Papa," she whispered. Eli dropped to one knee, tears burning behind his eyes. He opened his arms slowly, unsure, like a man approaching something sacred. "Hey there, darling," he said softly. The little girl took a hesitant step forward. Then another, and before anyone could stop her, she ran straight into his arms. He held her tight, his rough hands trembling against her small back, the weight of 7 years melting into the dust beneath them. Mary turned away for a moment, blinking hard. The wind carried the faint scent of rain and sagebrush, the same scent from the day he'd left. After a while, Clara approached too, quieter, older in her eyes than her years. "You really my father?" she asked, her voice steady but edged with caution. Eli looked at her, pride and regret tangled together. "Reckon I am. Leastways I aim to be, if you'll let me." She studied him for a long moment, then gave a small nod and stepped closer. He rested a hand on her shoulder, and though she didn't smile, she didn't pull away either. When he finally stood, he looked toward Mary. She hadn't moved. Her hands still gripped the gate, knuckles white. He took a slow step toward her. "You kept it standin'," he said quietly, nodding at the ranch. She finally met his gaze. Somebody had to. The bitterness in her voice was soft but sharp enough to draw blood. "I meant to come back sooner," Eli said, his voice low. "Life, it got away from me." Mary's eyes shimmered with both anger and pain. 7 years, Eli. You think I didn't count? Every spring, every letter that never came. Every time the girls asked where you were. "I know," he said, his voice cracking. "I know I failed you. I ain't asking you to forgive me." She looked at him for a long moment, really looked. The man before her wasn't the same reckless cowboy she'd married. He was older, slower, gentler somehow. The fire in his eyes hadn't gone out, but it burned differently now, warmer, steadier. Finally, she sighed. "You hungry?" He blinked. "What?" She turned toward the house. "Supper's on the stove. You can wash up at the well. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it wasn't rejection either." Eli nodded, hat still in hand, and watched as she walked ahead, her hair glowing copper in the last light, her daughters following close behind. For the first time in years, he felt something he'd forgotten, the ache of belonging. As he led his horse toward the barn, he noticed how time had touched everything. The corral fence leaned, the barn door hung crooked, the fields were drier than he remembered. Yet there was life here, chickens scratching in the dirt, the faint sound of a cow lowing, smoke rising from the chimney. He set his gear aside, splashed water on his face, and looked at his reflection in the trough. The man staring back was a stranger, and yet behind the lines and scars he saw a glimpse of the husband Mary once knew. As twilight deepened, lantern light flickered from the windows. He stood outside for a long while before stepping onto the porch. Through the open doorway he saw Mary ladling stew into bowls, the girls whispering and stealing glances at him. He hesitated, hat twisting in his hands. Then quietly he said, "Smells just like I remember." Mary didn't look up. "That's because it's the same recipe. Some things don't change." He smiled faintly and stepped inside. The warmth of the fire wrapped around him like an old memory. The wooden floor creaked beneath his boots, the same sound that once meant home. They ate mostly in silence, the only noise the clink of spoons and the crackle of the fire. Every now and then Eli would glance at Mary, trying to read the distance in her eyes. She caught him once and said softly, "You can't fix 7 years in one night." He nodded. "Didn't come to fix 'em, just hoping to start something new." For the first time, a shadow of a smile touched her lips. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a beginning. When the meal was done, the girls were sent to bed and the house grew quiet again. Outside, the moon rose pale over the desert hills. Eli stepped out to the porch, the old boards sighing beneath his weight. He looked toward the gate where he had stood hours earlier, where his life had begun again. Behind him, Mary's voice broke the silence. "You came home, Eli. That counts for something." He turned, met her eyes, and nodded. "Reckon it does," the wind whispered through the valley, and the lantern light flickered between them like a promise neither dared to speak aloud. And under that vast western sky, with the stars waking one by one, the Cartwright family began slowly, painfully, beautifully, to remember what home felt like, to remember what home felt like. Night had settled over the desert, soft and wide, the stars scattered like silver dust across the heavens. A thin wind swept through the valley, carrying the smell of mesquite smoke and far-off rain. Inside the old Cartwright house, a fire crackled in the stone hearth. Steady, warm, alive. For the first time in 7 years, the house felt full again. Eli sat by the fire, his boots off, socks warming near the flames. The girls had curled up on a faded rug beside him, their heads resting against each other, half asleep but refusing to drift off completely, afraid the moment might vanish like a dream. He had spent the past hour answering their questions, telling gentle stories of his travels, about wild horses in the Dakotas, storms that rolled across the plains, and stars so bright they could guide a man through darkness. He left out the gunfights and the loneliness. There were some truths a father didn't need to pass on. As he spoke, Mary listened from the kitchen doorway, her hands still busy drying a dish that had long been clean. The flickering light danced across her face, softening the hard edges time had carved there. She didn't interrupt. She just watched the man who had once been her world slowly become part of her home again. When Eli finally noticed her, he smiled. "You always said I talked too much." She gave a faint chuckle. 7 years of silence gives a man plenty to say. He nodded, rubbing his hands together before the fire. "Maybe so. Still, I'd trade every mile I rode just to have had supper here every night instead." Her eyes softened, though she didn't answer. A few minutes later, the girls were asleep. Eli lifted June gently into his arms, carrying her to the small room at the back. He tucked her in beneath a quilt stitched from old shirts and flour sacks, then kissed her forehead. For a moment, he just stood there, watching her breathe, wondering how many nights he'd missed. Birthdays, sicknesses, the 1,000 little things that made up a childhood. When he returned, Mary was sitting by the fire with a cup of coffee, staring into the flames. He poured himself a cup and sat beside her, leaving just enough space between them to respect the years that had passed. They sat in silence for a while. The fire popped and the wind tapped gently against the windows. Finally, Mary spoke. "You still wear that same hat?" Eli glanced at it hanging by the door and smiled. "Ain't had reason to change. Guess I was hoping there'd still be a few familiar things waiting for me." She sipped her coffee. "And did you find 'em?" He looked around, at the walls they'd built together, the old rocking chair she used to read in, the smell of stew still hanging in the air. Then he looked at her, found everything that ever mattered. Mary's eyes glistened, though she turned away quickly, pretending to adjust the fire. "You can't just walk in and expect life to pick up where it left off, Eli." "I know," he said quietly. "I ain't expecting that. I just want to earn my place back." Her voice softened. "The girls will want you around now. Don't make promises you can't keep again." He met her gaze, steady and sure. "I'm done riding away from things worth holding on to." The room fell silent again, filled only by the whisper of flames. Outside, the desert night hummed with life. Owls calling from the cottonwoods, coyotes yipping somewhere far off. The ranch breathed around them, creaking and sighing like an old friend remembering its purpose. After a while, Mary stood and walked to the window. "You hear that wind? Sounds the same as it did the night you left." Eli rose and joined her. Together they looked out over the land, their land, bathed in moonlight. The barn leaned, the fields were thin, but to Eli it looked like heaven. "I remember that night," he said quietly. "You were standing right where you are now. You told me not to be gone long." Mary's hand tightened around the window frame. "And you promised you wouldn't." "I did," he exhaled slowly. "And I broke it. But I ain't breaking it again." For a long moment neither spoke. Then she turned toward him. There were tears in her eyes, but there was also something else. Something softer, almost like peace. "You really mean to stay?" she asked. Eli nodded. "I've seen enough of the world to know there ain't nothing out there better than what's right here." She smiled faintly. "Then you best fix that barn before it falls down." He chuckled, the sound rough and real. "Guess I'll start tomorrow." They stood together for a long while, watching the moon climb higher. The firelight behind them glowed through the window, spilling gold across the porch, painting the scene like a memory in motion. Later, when the house had gone quiet and the last embers flickered low, Eli stepped outside. The air was cool, the stars endless. He walked to the gate, the same one he had touched hours earlier, and leaned against it. He ran his hand across the wood again, tracing the initials carved there. E+M. The letters were faded, But they were still there, still together, still surviving the years and storms. The desert stretched before him, vast and silent, but for the first time in years. He didn't feel lost. Behind him, the door opened softly. Mary stepped out, her shawl wrapped tight. Couldn't sleep? He shook his head. Didn't want the night to end. She joined him at the gate, standing so close he could feel her warmth. "The girls will be up early. They'll expect pancakes, I remember," he said with a smile. "You always burned the first batch." She laughed quietly, and the sound filled the cool air like music. For a long time, they just stood there side by side, watching the horizon lighten with the first blush of dawn. The night slowly gave way to gold, and the hills glowed under the newborn sun. Eli reached out, took her hand gently in his. She didn't pull away. "You kept the fire burning," he said softly. "All these years." Mary looked at him, eyes reflecting the sunrise. "Maybe I did. Maybe I was waiting for someone to tend it again." He nodded, his throat tight. "Then I'll tend it. Every day I got left." The sun broke over the ridge, spilling light across the ranch. The old wood gleamed, the air shimmered, and the desert, so long dry and lonely, seemed to breathe again. Eli Cartwright turned toward his home. His wife, his daughters, everything he'd thought he'd lost. The dust on his boots no longer felt like burden, but proof of the road that had led him here. The cowboy had finally finished his ride. And as the morning wind carried the scent of coffee and hope through the air, the firelight inside the Cartwright home burned steady once more. A flame reborn, a love returned, a family made whole. A family made whole.